Going beyond the limiting factors of the lower self requires the willingness in one's feeling, in one's direct experience, to go through death, to walk through the gateway, the portal of death. The survival structure, as psychological conditioning, maintains its boundary, maintains its border, maintains its field of the known in order to feel as if it's maintaining and sustaining life. And insofar as that translates psychologically, it keeps one stuck within a very limited sphere of perception. So in order to break through the limited sphere of perception, which has become the psychological prison in which we live and therefore preventing us from perceiving what is the way it is, there has to be a willingness to die. There has to be a willingness to release the known, to go beyond the known. And that's impossible to do without meeting death, without encountering that force, that entity, or not entity, but rather that experience or that idea that we call death. And it's only by walking through that gateway of death without sacrificing the body that we, while we yet live, come into the expanded awareness, the expanded realization of the very essence of what it is we really are, and therefore what it is we're doing here. The opening of the inner temple, of the inner sanctuary, which is not a mere concept. This is now going beyond all concept, and this is where things begin to take a turn for the ecstatic, and also for the terrifying, for those who are unwilling to go beyond their lower nature, unwilling to go beyond the lower self, because there's too much fear and clinging to survival, particularly psychologically, which is quite unfortunate because we're no longer living in the jungle. We're no longer living in nature. In fact, if you're watching this, then you clearly have the capacity to sit undisturbed without worrying about wild animals coming to eat you, or people from the neighboring village coming to, destroy your agricultural homestead or whatever the situation might be. You have a pacified environment in so many ways. And even though we've situated ourselves upon this planet in such a way that allows for us, and this is the point, when this has done its job, it allows for the possibility of us to simply sit quietly in silence, trusting that we will actually be all right, regardless of how we feel, in order to have an opening of the heart, an opening of the true self, in order to be able to expand into the actual capacities of what the higher centers of self are, to actually see what the voice is, to actually see what the brain is, to actually see what we call the third eye is, and for that to be open and active, for us to actually be aware of the crown center, and many more aspects, facets of the human being, of the human form. But actually, not merely conceptually, that does no good. Conceptual understanding is still simply merely the lower self trying to use, because all concepts are for survival. When you go beyond the survival mechanism, concepts are no longer of any real value, because the real thing is not conceptual. A heart opening is not conceptual. Awareness of the throat is not conceptual. Awareness of the third eye, or what we call the third eye being open or awake or active, is not conceptual. The crown being active is not conceptual. So, the willingness to flower into a full human being means the willingness to go beyond one's fear of losing, of not getting, of not gaining. And this requires going beyond the instinctual drive inculcated into the human biology, the system, and the psychological faculty over the course of millions and millions of years of evolution. So it's no small feat. It takes everything you've got. But there's no other way to go. The only other way is death of the actual physical organism, and not just your death in particular, but the death of all physical organism. So the gateway is death. The gateway is death. Death must be faced, it must be looked at, it must be felt, it must be known, it must be experienced. It must be. There's no getting around it. Which means there's no avoiding what we call the shadow. There's no avoiding the underworld. And as it turns out, I am an underworld Sherpa. That's one of my functions. One of the functions of this form is as an underworld Sherpa. I know it very well. And when you come out the other side of the underworld, what you see is that the whole time it was a projection of thought itself. There's no underworld without knowledge. There's no ignorance without knowledge. There's no darkness without something blocking the light. It's the most obvious thing. So what is it that's blocking the light? What's keeping the light out? And why are you holding on to it? And then crying about the pain of being stuck in the darkness. You see, that's the fundamental question. And to see it is to really recognize that we've been living quite deliberately in our own foolishness, in the shadow of our own foolishness, in the shadow of our own, may I say, stupidity. We've been living in the shadow of our own ignorance for millennia and millennia and millennia, and blaming some external force, whether we've chosen to blame the devil, whether we've chosen to blame the God. We keep blaming something, and this comes back to the conversation, because this has to be faced, the conversation that we had earlier of evil or wickedness and its origin, and the very convenient attempt to blame something outside of the human being. I want you to look very carefully and see, what is violence? What is trauma? What is it? Do animals, what we call animals, they do what they have to do to survive, basically, but they don't go around destroying themselves. They don't engage or commit acts of what human beings would call evil. That's a uniquely human phenomena. So, the human being, what's the origin of the violence that human beings commit upon one another, knowing very well they don't have to? The unwillingness to share, the unwillingness to cooperate, the unwillingness to be and to let be, the desire that every human being has to control another, to insist that another lives the way they want to live, the way that they think the other should live. And if you don't dress the way I dress, or speak the way I speak, or pray the way I pray, or engage in worshipful activity the way that I engage in worshipful activity, if you don't speak the language I speak, or if you're not part of the same group or the same tribe or the same family, or part of the same gender, or if I think that your way of living, though you aren't actually harming anybody, but I don't like it. I don't like your activity. According to my cultural programming, it's wrong or it's incorrect, etc., etc., etc. Right? That division. between me and you, between us and them. What's the basis of that? It's fear, obviously. It is fear, the very fact of making that division. There's a fear of oneself being corrupted by some outside force. And so one must erect a wall around oneself in order to keep the bad out, right? The other must be kept out. That very division is the source of what we call evil, of what we call violence. Because there is no other. There is no other. And the fear of the other is a projection of one's fear of one's own self. And people often admit this in religious conversations, where they say, if it wasn't for my religion, or if it wasn't for my belief in this or that or the other, I would be a terrible person, right? And people are afraid that the truth of who they really are is something terrible, something wicked, something violent, something dark, in the way that we use that word culturally. But you don't know that. You haven't actually looked. You've been told that about yourself, but when you were a child, and you were in your true state of being, how were you? Were you dark? No. Children run and they play and they laugh and they scream, and they live with total abandon, total ecstasy, total joy. It's not until you begin developing a concern for the way that you appear to people in order to continue receiving their love, their affection, their attention, their sympathy, that you begin cutting off parts of yourself that you know are totally natural and fine, and put it into some place back here where you can't see it and no one else can see it. That's the creation of the shadow. So the shadow is a totally artificial creation. It's not natural. Now you can call it natural in the sense of it's part of the movement of thought. Thought misunderstood creates that, which is relationship misunderstood, relationship misapplied, or relationship mishandled. Trying to use thought, division, to artificially invent or create a certain structure of relationship naturally has as the consequence the creation of the shadow. But the shadow is an artificial creation. And it's in the shadow that human beings do terrible things to one another. It's from that place of fear, of guilt, of shame, which is hatred, that human beings commit violence against one another, do terrible things to one another, in fear of getting hurt. I'm afraid that you're going to hurt me, so I must hurt you first. I'm afraid of retribution, so I must do something terrible to you so that you know not to mess with me, right? Or I'm afraid of, getting, I've, done something perhaps innocent and someone doesn't see it as that and they're going to go tell on me, and so I've got to stop them before they go in, right? But anyway, that the shadow is already created over here, otherwise there would simply be the raw perception of innocence. And so if one looks out and doesn't see innocence, then there's shadow. When the heart opens, one sees clearly that everything is innocent. Innocence is the nature of creation. Innocence is the nature of the human being. Innocence is the nature of love. Innocence is the nature of truth. Innocence is the nature of joy, of compassion, of ecstasy. Innocence. Innocence. And that innocence is incorruptible. Nothing can corrupt innocence. The word innocent means untouchable, untouched. Innocence is not corruptible. But we've created a psychological image, a psychological concept of innocence, and as a concept, all concepts are corruptible. All concepts are corruption itself. And so the idea of an innocence which can be lost is not innocence, it's conceptual innocence, and that very conceptual innocence is part of the shadow. Do you see that? That's how tricky the mind is. That's how tricky the conditioned mind is. And the willingness to go beyond that, it cannot be done unless you're willing to see yourself and know yourself exactly as you are. which means the willingness to feel the feeling of the whole world turning against you. And you have to be okay with that, because you see that the world that would turn against you for simply being as you are in your pure, innocent state is simply the world of the shadow. No real human being would ever be against another real human being. You can't be. It's only versus conflict, that division, that warfare is a thing of the shadow. Because a real human being in fullness, in innocence, is a being in love, in joy, in peace. And such a being is not in conflict with anything or anyone. And so when human beings who are in their innocence are here together, they're not in conflict. And if there is some temporary, crash or kerfuffle or something, it's looked at immediately, things are solved, and it's done. It's completely over with. There's no carrying of a psychological memory of that into the next moment, a concept of that into the next moment. You watch it with kids all the time. They foom and they go, wah, and then they're done. It's over and they're right back to playing. It's only when a parent or an older sibling or a member of society has instilled a sense of guilt or shame or retribution into the child that they begin holding grudges and taking things personally. Otherwise, nothing's taken personally. When one is in pure innocence, nothing's taken personally. Nothing is taken as a deep and everlasting attack on the self. And so in order for that idea of the person as such to really be rooted in to a small human, to a child, it has to be perpetually enforced by somebody else, by a so-called outside actor, which then, you see how it transfers? How the concept of the limited self is like a virus that transfers from person to person, but its root is in ignorance, its root is in the shadow. And so you see that the whole world, in so many ways, is acting and has been acting for many, 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 thousands of years out of the shadow. And when you see that the shadow actually isn't real, the shadow isn't real. It's an illusion, it's a projection, it's an artificial invention of thought. It's created out of fear, but it is fear itself. And when you can simply look at it, without being afraid of it, it loses its power. It dissolves, and you see that it was simply a projection over what is perfectly innocent. And this return to innocence, this return to the natural self, this is the opening of the heart, which then reveals the nature of the so-called higher self, which then doesn't even need to be conceptualized as the higher self, because it's only the lower self that conceives of a higher self. When the higher self is actually present, the lower self is actually seen to be non-existent. It's a mirage. There only ever was the higher self. And so, from the perspective of the so-called higher self, from being here in consciousness, there isn't even a need to go around considering unconsciousness. There isn't a need to have any mythological conception of it, you see? And so, all the conceptions of awakening or of spirituality or of the higher self, those conceptions are merely there, we see as an outpouring of an attempt by the higher self to reach the lower self, because of the fact that the lower self has emerged as a consequence of thought misplaced. So if human beings are simply allowed to be in that innocence always, if there is no shadow here lurking, which was created by thought to try to bring as many human beings into it as possible. It's a virus, and it's unconscious, by the way. That's why it's called unconsciousness. So it's not that the shadow is deliberately doing anything. It can't deliberately do anything. It's a mechanism, but it's a very ingenious mechanism. It's the perfect trap. The shadow is the perfect trap. It's the perfect trap. Trauma is the perfect trap. It's the perfect trap because you could only get out through total consciousness. But anyway, total consciousness is the nature of the human being. And so really it takes the willingness to be totally human, completely human, in order to get out of the trap. And to be totally human means being able and willing to feel anything, to meet anything, to encounter anything, because there's a knowledge that one is, in one's true, innocent, natural state, deathless. Because one is not the body. The body appears here as a tool within consciousness, but consciousness itself is that which is eternal. And one knows this very well, especially the minute the shadow initially begins to creep in to make its debut in childhood. And the people around you begin to tell you that because of the shape or the configuration or the color of your body, that you're not supposed to behave this way or talk this way or think this way or act this way or walk this way or etc., play with this kind of toy, etc., etc., etc. And you go, wait a minute. When you're simply here in yourself as raw being, as what you could call the soul, or in innocence, there's nothing in between you and life. Nothing. The body's not in between you and life. The body's simply here as a medium. It's here as an intermediary between the non-physical and the physical. It is the physical. It is the physical manifest, or it's the non-physical manifest as the physical, in order to interact here in the physical plane, to put it a certain way. Again, when you're actually here in consciousness, you don't need any kind of words to explain it. And so the speaking is really for the sake of it's a grace, really, that comes from, or that is meant for the dissolution of all lies that are the essence of the lower self or the shadow, covering the truth. So we try to speak in as many ways as we can in order to, dare I say, corner the shadow, because the shadow runs. That you turn on the light and the shadow flees. And there really is nowhere for it to go. And so it really only pretends to run because it can't really run anywhere. There's nowhere for it to run, nowhere for it to hide. And so as long as one is living as the shadow, one feels oneself to be in a constant state of existential dread and anxiety, because one is living as that which is always trying to run and hide, but which can never run and hide. And the moment that fear and guilt and shame are dropped, then the shadow goes with it. There's nothing. If you're not afraid of anything, if you're not ashamed of anything that you are, if you don't feel guilty about being what you are, then anything that anybody tells you to the contrary, you see is just silly. If someone says, for example, you're a man, and therefore you need to behave like this, and walk like this, and talk like that, it's like, what? You understand what I'm saying. Or you're a woman, and therefore you should walk like this, and talk like this, and not do this, and not... It's like, what? Where does that come from? Right? Or you're a part of this culture, and therefore you can't listen to this kind of music. It's like, what? You see? So if you are simply okay, comfortable with being in your innocence, it doesn't matter what anybody has. No one can tell you anything. No one can tell you anything. Because being here in your innocence is being in consciousness, which means having omniscient perception of self, of everything. And so no one can tell you anything. You're totally sovereign. There's nothing to tell. There's nothing to tell. Either we are, putting survival means together, housing, food, water, medical care, education, income, utilities and amenities. Either we're technologically engaged in sustaining survival, or we're expressing the incredible joy and magnificence of our being There's nothing else to be doing. And if you're aware of the joy of being, then you're aware of the beauty of being able to orchestrate survival for everybody. Because the minute survival is orchestrated for us and not for them, then it just warfare is created, and then there's no joy. And so anything about how a human being should be and creating philosophies around that is just ridiculously stupid. Every human being knows how they should be. It's not a mystery. There's no mystery as to how a human being should be. That's not a matter of theology. It's not a matter of philosophy. It's not a matter of psychology. That's all ridiculous. Every human being knows how they ought to be, how they should be. Not according to this or that or the other, but inwardly. Every human being deeply knows who they are. Deeply. Beyond words. And to simply be here as what you are, without fear of anybody coming up to you and telling you that you're a wrong kind of being for being how you are. I'm not talking about engaging in activity that harms people. If you're walking around stabbing people, right, you should stop. If you're walking around exploiting people, that's, you see, behavior of exploitation of human beings, of creatures, of nature. That's the problem. But there's no desire to exploit but by the shadow. In the innocent state of natural being, there's zero desire to exploit. You see? And so the natural state of being human is the safest place to be. In fact, it's the natural, you see? But the mythology is that unless you are corrected by our cultural philosophy or our religious philosophy or our social philosophy, you'll just be terrible. No, those are all meant to correct the shadow. The natural human being is not in the shadow. The natural human being is totally innocent and pure and free. It takes social conditioning to bring one into the shadow. And then we develop all kinds of philosophies and techniques and modalities and so on to try to get rid of the shadow. But the very source, which is creating the techniques, the philosophies, and the modalities to get rid of the shadow, is the same source of the shadow. And so every philosophy, every tradition is a manifestation of the shadow, and so we're trying to use the shadow to get rid of the shadow. Do you see that? There's nothing to do to get rid of the shadow other than to simply be what you are naturally, which means to drop all of the clothing, all of the external skins that you've acquired and accumulated over the course of a lifetime. The familial skin, the cultural skin, the religious skin, all of the so-called philosophical skins that you've accumulated through the various institutional phases or forces that you've endured, that you've moved through, in order to fit in order to be the right kind of person for this kind of place. Quite naturally, the human being learns about everything. But to be in that mode of artificial self-protection in order to avoid, and there's some sense in it because the shadow is itself hurt, but then that very hurt of the shadow creates more shadow as a defense mechanism against the shadow. And so everything that comes from shadow is a defense mechanism against itself. It's a defense mechanism against shadow, but the shadow as perceived as coming from the other. But it's the same thing as the shadow that ends up coming, or as a consequence of oneself being severed and cut off from oneself, in one's direct experience of oneself, out of the necessity to stay safe from the other. You see? So it's a total mess. And when you actually stand back and look at it, it's really a sad, sick joke. But in the moment that one perceives that danger, it seems like it's anything but a joke. In fact, it seems like it's the only reality. And so this is the great trouble. This is the great situation in which we find ourselves. And we've had the luxury up to this point in time to dilly-dally a bit and pretend that we have, a lot of time to figure it out, but we've now hit the end of time. We've now hit the end of history. We've now hit the end of the rope. And so we're now at that point in time where we have to go beyond. Otherwise, we will succumb to the misery and the darkness and the depression and the perpetual traumatic, violent ignorance, which is the very nature of the shadow, which is anyway seen once you go beyond it to be non-existent. It doesn't actually exist. It's a projection of a mixture of knowledge and ignorance. And so the shadow really is the shadow of our own ignorance. And there's nothing to be afraid of. Nothing to be afraid of. So, this is, I think, where we end today in this talk, in this conversation. So, to be continued as words are needed, but here we are, and I'm with you, and every being is with you. Every being of light is with you. The dragons are with you. Dragons, true dragons, are incredible beings of light, of fantastic energy. The Ascended Masters are with you. All the great ones are with you. You are supported, you're cared for, you're loved. And it's time to step into the fullness of being, to return to the true and natural state of who and what you really are. May you know the peace and the joy and the love and the innocence and the bliss and the ecstasy of your natural being. No conflict within, no resistance to yourself, to simply be as you are, always. Oh. Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityormamritam Gamaya Shanti Shanti Shanti